Space is fake. The three-dimensional universe you think you live in, the distances between objects, the volume of your room, the vast emptiness between stars, all of it is an illusion. A holographic projection. A trick your brain plays on you to make sense of something far stranger. You don't live in space. Space is not a container that holds things. Space is not real in the way you think it is. And when you understand why, everything you thought you knew about reality will collapse. I'm Leonard Susskind, and for 50 years I've been studying the deepest structure of the universe: black holes, quantum mechanics, string theory, and all of it points to one disturbing conclusion. Space is emergent. Space is derived. Space is a useful fiction that appears when you look at reality from a limited perspective. The real universe has no space. Not in 3 dimensions, not in any dimensions. Reality is fundamentally something else entirely. Let me start with something simple. Look around you. You see objects at different distances. Some things are close, some things are far away. You can measure these distances. You can walk from here to there. Space seems obvious. It seems like the most basic feature of reality. How could space be fake? Here's the problem. Everything we've learned about fundamental physics in the last 50 years tells us that space cannot be fundamental. The evidence comes from black holes. In the 1970s, Jacob Bekenstein and Stephen Hawking discovered something shocking. Black holes have entropy. Entropy measures information, the number of possible microscopic states a system can have. For normal objects, entropy scales with volume. A box twice as big has twice as much entropy because it can hold twice as much stuff. But black holes are different. The entropy of a black hole is proportional to the area of its event horizon, not its volume. Think about what this means. If you have a region of space and you want to know how much information it can contain, you don't calculate the volume. You calculate the surface area of the boundary. The information is not distributed throughout the volume. It's encoded on the surface. This suggests something profound. Space is not 3-dimensional at its most fundamental level. Space is 2-dimensional. And the 3-dimensional interior we experience is somehow derived from information on the 2-dimensional boundary. This is the holographic principle. The idea that our universe is a hologram, a 3-dimensional projection from information encoded on a distant 2-dimensional surface. Now, you might think this is just a curious mathematical fact about black holes, but it's much more than that. In the late 1990s, Juan Maldacena discovered something extraordinary. He found a precise mathematical relationship between 2 completely different theories. On one side, you have a quantum field theory living on a lower dimensional boundary. This theory has no gravity, no extra dimensions, no space in the bulk. It's just quantum fields on a flat boundary. On the other side, you have a full theory of gravity in a higher dimensional curved space-time. And these 2 theories are exactly equivalent. Every calculation you can do in one theory has a corresponding calculation in the other theory that gives the same answer. This is the AD-S-CFT correspondence. And it proves, mathematically, rigorously, that space-time can emerge from a theory with no space-time. Let me explain what this means. The boundary theory is fundamental. It's a quantum theory with no notion of the extra dimension, no notion of the interior space, just quantum fields living on a lower dimensional surface. But when you look at the quantum state of this boundary theory, when you study the correlations and entanglement in the state, a geometry emerges. You can calculate how particles would move in that emergent geometry, and their motion exactly matches what you get from general relativity in the higher dimensional space. The space is not fundamental. The space emerges from quantum information on the boundary. The 3-dimensional space, or in the actual AD-CFT case, the higher dimensional anti-de Sitter space, is a hologram generated by quantum entanglement on the boundary. Now, AD-CFT is mathematically proven. It's not speculation. We can do calculations on both sides and verify they match. This tells us something profound about the nature of space. Space is not a fundamental ingredient of reality. Space is emergent. It arises from patterns of quantum entanglement. And if space can be emergent and add CFT, it's almost certainly emergent in our universe too. Our universe is not exactly add space. We have a cosmological constant, dark energy, accelerating expansion, but the principle is the same. Space emerges from quantum information. The three-dimensional universe we experience is a holographic projection from information on the cosmological horizon. Let me make this concrete. Imagine you're looking at this screen right now. You think you're in a three-dimensional room. You think there's distance between you and the screen. But according to the holographic principle, that's an illusion. The fundamental reality is information encoded on a distant two-dimensional surface, the cosmological horizon, roughly 46 billion light years away in all directions. That information, that two-dimensional quantum state, generates the hologram you're experiencing. The room you're in, the screen you're looking at, your body, all of it is a projection. You're not in space. You are space. Or more precisely, you are a pattern in the holographic projection generated by quantum information on the boundary. Now, you might be thinking, this is crazy. I can measure space. I can use a ruler. I can walk from here to there. How can space be fake if I can measure it? And the answer is that emergence is real. Even though space is emergent, it's still real at the level you experience it. Just like temperature is emergent from molecular motion but still real, just like solidity is emergent from electromagnetic forces but your table is still solid, space is emergent from quantum entanglement, but the emergent space is real for you. The distances you measure are real. The geometry is real. But it's derived, not fundamental. It's a useful description that appears at low energies and large scales, but it's not the deepest level of reality. Let me tell you why space has to be emergent. It comes from information theory. In any physical system, there's a limit to how much information can be stored in a region. This limit is called the Bekenstein bound. And the Bekenstein bound says that the maximum entropy, the maximum information in a region is proportional to the area of the boundary, not the volume. If you have a sphere of radius r, the maximum entropy is proportional to r squared, the surface area, not r cubed, the volume. This is fundamentally incompatible with space being three-dimensional all the way down. If space were truly three-dimensional, you could subdivide it arbitrarily finely and store arbitrarily large amounts of information in a given volume. But the Bekenstein bound says you can't. The information is bounded by area. This tells us that degrees of freedom, the fundamental units of information, are not distributed throughout three-dimensional space. They're distributed on two-dimensional surfaces. Space cannot be fundamental. It must be emergent. And this is not just theory. We see direct evidence for this in black holes. When you throw matter into a black hole, all the information about that matter gets encoded on the event horizon. The three-dimensional matter falls in, but its information is spread out on the two-dimensional surface. The information doesn't disappear into the three-dimensional interior. It lives on the two-dimensional boundary. The interior, from an information perspective, is redundant. It's a holographic projection of the information on the horizon. Now let me connect this to quantum mechanics, because this is where it gets really strange. In quantum mechanics, the state of a system is described by a wave function, and the wave function lives in a configuration space, not in physical space. For a single particle, the wave function depends on position, so you might think it lives in physical space. But for two particles, the wave function depends on both positions. It's a function on a six-dimensional configuration space, 3 dimensions for each particle. For n particles, the configuration space has 3 n dimensions. This is not physical space. This is an abstract mathematical space. And the wave function, which contains all the information about the system, lives in this abstract space, not in physical space. Physical space is what you get when you make measurements, when you localize particles to definite positions. But the fundamental description, the wave function, doesn't live in physical space. It lives in Hilbert space, an abstract, infinite dimensional space. Physical space is emergent. It's what appears when you project the wave function down, when you coarse grain, when you make measurements. The fundamental quantum state has no notion of physical space. Space emerges from correlations in the quantum state, and this is exactly what the holographic principle tells us. The fundamental description is the quantum state on the boundary. Physical space in the interior emerges from entanglement patterns in that quantum state. Let me tell you what this means for the Big Bang. In the standard picture, the Big Bang is the beginning of space and time. The universe starts as a point, infinitely dense, infinitely hot, and then expands. Space itself expands. But if space is emergent, this picture changes. Space is not fundamental, so it doesn't make sense to say space began at the Big Bang. What began at the Big Bang was the emergent space-time description. Before the Big Bang, if before even makes sense, there was no space. There was just the fundamental quantum state, timeless and spaceless. The Big Bang is where the emergent description becomes useful, where space and time first appear as good approximate concepts. Think of it like this. The fundamental quantum state just is. It's timeless, spaceless. When you look at correlations in that state, when you organize the information in certain ways, notions of space and time emerge. You can define a geometry. You can trace that geometry backward, and you reach a point where it becomes singular, where the emergent description breaks down. That's the Big Bang. It's not the beginning of the quantum state. It's the beginning of space-time. The quantum state exists eternally, and the Big Bang is where the holographic projection, the emergent space-time, first emerges from it. This resolves the singularity problem. There's no actual singularity because space and time are not fundamental. The singularity is an artifact of pushing the emergent description into a regime where it doesn't apply. Now let me address what you're probably thinking. If space is fake, what about all the stuff in space? What about planets, stars, galaxies? Are they fake too? And the answer is subtle. They're not fake, they're real, but they're real as features of the emergent hologram. The fundamental description is quantum information on the boundary. That information is organized in certain ways, has certain correlation patterns, and when you interpret those patterns in terms of the emergent space-time, you see planets and stars and galaxies. These objects are real in the emergent description, but they're not fundamental. They're derived from the underlying quantum information. Think about pixels on a screen. The pixels are real, you can see them, you can count them, but the image on the screen is emergent. It's a pattern formed by the pixels. The image is real, but it's not fundamental. The fundamental entities are the pixels. Space is like the image. Matter and energy are like patterns in the image. And the fundamental reality is the quantum information on the boundary, like the pixels. Everything you see, every object, every structure is a pattern in the holographic projection. Real at the emergent level, but not fundamental. Let me tell you why this matters. Why you should care that space is fake. Because it changes everything about how we understand physics. For centuries, we thought of the universe as objects moving through space, governed by forces. Newton gave us laws of motion in space. Einstein curved space and time into space-time. But all of that is the emergent description. The fundamental description is quantum information and entanglement. The laws of physics we know: general relativity, electromagnetism, the standard model of particle physics. These are all emergent laws. They describe how the hologram behaves. But the fundamental law is simpler. It's quantum mechanics on the boundary. Everything else derives from that. This is the holy grail of theoretical physics. A unified theory, not a theory that describes all the forces and particles in space-time, but a theory that shows how space-time itself emerges from something more fundamental. And we have it, at least in special cases like AD-CFT. We know how it works. The challenge is extending it to our universe, to cosmology, to the real world we live in. But the principle is established. Space is emergent. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to thinking space is fundamental. Now, let me get personal for a moment. When I first encountered these ideas decades ago, when I first understood the holographic principle, it disturbed me. If space is fake, what am I? Where am I? If distances are illusions, what does it mean to be here rather than there? And the answer is that you are a pattern in the holographic projection. You are information on the boundary, organized in such a way that it creates the experience of being a localized observer in three-dimensional space. Your sense of being in a location, your sense of distance from other objects, these are features of how you process information, not features of fundamental reality. You are not in space. You are space or a part of it, a pattern in the emergent hologram. And here's something beautiful. If space is emergent from entanglement, then the structure of space tells us about entanglement. Regions that are close in space correspond to degrees of freedom that are highly entangled. Regions that are far apart correspond to degrees of freedom with less entanglement. Distance in space is entanglement in the quantum state. When you walk from here to there, you're not moving through fundamental space. You're changing the entanglement structure of the quantum state. Motion is not fundamental. Motion is how we describe changes in entanglement patterns in the emergent description. This connects to something profound in quantum mechanics, quantum entanglement. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. When two particles are entangled, measuring one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. This seems to violate locality, the idea that things only affect nearby things. But if space is emergent from entanglement, there's no violation. The particles aren't really separated in fundamental space because there is no fundamental space. They're entangled degrees of freedom in the quantum state, and entanglement is non-local by nature. The appearance of spatial separation is emergent. At the fundamental level, entangled particles are connected, and the connection is more fundamental than the space between them. Let me tell you about something called the ER equals EPR conjecture. This is an idea I developed with Juan Maldacena. ER stands for Einstein-Rosen bridges, wormholes connecting distant points in space. EPR stands for Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen, the original paper on quantum entanglement. The conjecture is that these are the same thing. Entangled particles are connected by tiny wormholes. Space, even at the classical level, is woven together by quantum entanglement. The geometry of space is entanglement. This is still being worked out, but if it's true, it's the ultimate proof that space is emergent. Space is literally constructed from entanglement threads connecting quantum degrees of freedom. Now you might ask, if space is fake, can we manipulate it? Can we create space, destroy space, change the geometry at will? And the answer is, in principle, maybe. If we could control quantum entanglement at the Planck scale, if we could manipulate the quantum state on the boundary, we could change the emergent geometry. We could create new regions of space, connect distant regions through wormholes, maybe even create baby universes. This is far beyond current technology. We can barely control quantum entanglement in laboratory systems with a few qubits. Controlling the entanglement structure of space-time itself is science fiction, but the principle is there. If space is emergent, it can be engineered, computed, programmed, like any other emergent phenomenon. Let me bring this back to something you can think about. Right now, you think you're in a room, watching a screen, occupying a location in three-dimensional space. But that's not what's really happening. What's really happening is far stranger. There's a quantum state on a distant two-dimensional surface. That state has certain correlation patterns, certain entanglement structures. Those patterns, when interpreted through the lens of emergent geometry, create the experience of being you in a room, looking at a screen. The room is not a container you're inside. The room is part of the holographic projection. You and the room are both patterns in the same hologram, generated by the same quantum information on the boundary. Does this mean you're not real? No. You're real, your experiences are real, the room is real, but they're real at the emergent level. They're real as features of the hologram. The fundamental reality is the quantum information, and you are a pattern in how that information is organized. This doesn't make you less real, it makes you differently real. You're not a separate object in space. You're part of the structure of space itself. You are the hologram experiencing itself from one particular perspective. And here's what I find most beautiful. If space is emergent, if it's constructed from entanglement, then everything is connected at the deepest level. The boundaries between here and there, between you and me, between past and future, these are all features of the emergent description. At the fundamental level, there are no boundaries. There's one quantum state, one unified whole, and the appearance of separation is the hologram. You are not separate from the universe. You are not in space, you are space. Part of the fundamental quantum state that generates everything, the hologram is not an illusion in the sense of being false. It's an illusion in the sense of being derived, emergent, a useful description at our scale, but not the deepest truth. Space is fake. Not fake in the sense of not existing, but fake in the sense of not being fundamental. Space emerges from quantum entanglement on a lower dimensional boundary. The three-dimensional universe is a hologram, and you are part of that hologram, a pattern of information processing experiencing the emergent geometry from the inside. This is what 50 years of theoretical physics has taught us. This is where the mathematics leads. This is what black holes and holography and quantum mechanics are telling us. Space is not real in the way you think. Space is emergent. And recognizing this is one of the great intellectual achievements of our time. We've seen past the hologram to the fundamental reality beneath. And that reality is more strange, more beautiful, more unified than any picture of space as a fundamental container could ever be. Welcome to the real universe, where space is fake and everything is connected